Good morning, it's Brother Peter with tidbits from the Word, and I want to go into the Lord's Prayer this morning. This one will be dubbed the Lord's Prayer. I want to talk, it's in Matthew chapter 6. Remember that. Mark that down in your brain this morning. If you're not familiar where the Lord's Prayer is, it's in Matthew chapter 6. Now, when I'm on these little excerpts of the Word, I'm talking to many different types of people. I'm talking to people who have just got in to the Word. I'm talking to people who do not know Jesus yet and have never been in the Word. I'm talking to some who are preachers and looking for something or somebody to say something they can use in another message or whatever. And I'm also talking to people who are scholarly and who would disagree with me when I say this is the Lord's Prayer. Well, you may have a PhD or a DD or a doctorate, and you may be one of those who has a controversial mind, and your own mind makes you have controversy in your life because of your intellect. Well, your intellect does not supersede spirituality at any given time in your life. Intellect is an enemy to spirituality. Paul said, the apostle said this, to die daily. For me to live is death, but for Christ to live is gain. Now, when I call this the Lord's Prayer, Jesus gave this as a model prayer for his 12 apostles, his disciples, to use on a daily basis. And so many people today have said, oh, that's not the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer is over in another place. Well, the prayer that the Lord prayed to God, his Father, is in another place. And that's the Lord praying to his Father. We're not going to pray that prayer. We can't pray that prayer. We're not going to face taking the sin of the world on us on the cross. That was the Lord praying to his Father. But the Lord's Prayer that we're concerned about is what he directed his very apostles to pray on a daily basis. Do you think that he would have directed his apostles to do this prayer on a daily basis and then tell you, well, it doesn't really mean anything, this is for children or kids or whatever? No, your intellect has superseded your spirituality. And now your intellect is like the last one of these excerpts I did a little while ago was on the scribes and Pharisees. The scribes and Pharisees had a problem. Their problem was their intellect wanted to override the spiritual facts. And the spiritual facts were they were living in a day and an age when things were fixing to change and change in a great way. They were going to change from law to grace. Hey, when grace came along, a man could eat food with dirty hands if he wanted to. And but before that came along, you know what God had to do, and I hate to go back this far and get into it, but you know what? There's a thing called physical hygiene. And do you know how God worked physical hygiene? He said to those folks back in the Old Testament, after you handle this meat over here, wash your hands real good before you eat. Was that a spiritual thing? No, that was a physical thing. If you didn't wash your hands before you ate after you handled meat and then you go eat cooked meat, you had that dead meat on your hands and it could kill you. It could kill you. Look, there's some common sense. How about putting some common sense with some thought? How about putting a little common sense with some thought? All through the Old Testament where Jesus talked about the sacrifices, and he talked about washing the meat. He talked about washing your hands. He talked about washing the pot and the leaven. He talked about washing this and that, everything. That wasn't all because for the sacrifice. The sacrifice was the shedding of the blood. All the rest of that was common sense talk, and that he was telling the people how to do it so they wouldn't get sick. If they had not done what Jesus said to do, which wasn't law, by the way, which was common sense fact that people didn't know. But God knew that if they didn't wash their hands between all of these things they were doing, And then God said another thing. Don't mix these meats. Don't handle this meat. Don't handle raw fish and then raw beef, because the two of them mixed together, they're they make a disease. They make you sick. They'll make you have sickness. You'll think you're dying. So let's go back to the common sense of this thing. And you know, I ought to name this particular excerpt, I guess, Common Sense Thinking, because I'm not even going to get into the Lord's Prayer on this one here. So we'll name this one Common Sense, and we'll get in the Lord's Prayer on the next one. But look, let's go back into the Old Testament, Leviticus, and look at the laws. And then what we talked about in the last one was those scribes and Pharisees. They had put so much weight on the washing of your hands and everything that they had missed the fact that the cleansing that was to take place back in that day from the sacrifice was to cleanse the inside of a man so that he could come before a righteous God. It was not what he did with his body, washing his hands and doing all that washing and all that cleaning and all that removing. Hey, that was not a spiritual thing, removing the liver and the spleen and all the things that they removed. You know what they were removing? They were removing the parts that went out onto the dung field out there into the burning pit. In Gehenna, outside of the walls of Jerusalem, was a place called Gehenna. It was a dump. It burned night and day continually, and they had to take those parts and that waste from inside that animal out there, put them on that dump and burn them. Why? They'd make disease. My friend did make disease, and God didn't want disease in amongst all of that they were doing. So, listen, a lot of that instruction that he's given, you can't weigh that as a spiritual act. It was an act of cleanliness, and God knew there had to be cleanliness with the act of sacrifice. So the act of sacrifice, shedding the blood, was what covered the sins of man. All that other stuff they did was protection for them. God had to give them directions and give them protection so they wouldn't kill their own self by not washing their hands. You know, penicillin didn't come along for a long time. And by the way, penicillin's for an after the fact. Penicillin, you don't go get penicillin before you get when you get sick, then you use penicillin to fight that sickness off. But if you had followed the rules that God said, there's a good chance you wouldn't need to use that penicillin, because you wouldn't be in that position to have the penicillin to use it. How many people do you know use penicillin on a daily basis? Hardly anybody would have to do that. You can't. And by the way, if you overuse penicillin, it becomes of no effect. So I'm telling you this morning, look at the facts. Look at the Bible realistically. Will you look at the Bible realistically? Will you sort out what's being said, when it's being said, why it's being said, who it's being said to, how it's being delivered, and what for? Look at those 5 things, 6 things, but 5 of them. When, where, what, how, and why. Look at those things and cipher out how many of those things, some of those are spiritual and some of them are physical. Now, God was working with physical bodies. When he was working with the children of Israel, he was working with a corrupt body, and through that corrupt body, he was having them do a righteous act. The righteous act was shedding the blood. After they shed the blood, then they had to do some physical acts. The physical acts that God had there were not the righteous acts. The righteous act was shedding the blood. The physical acts were for safety reasons, so that they wouldn't end up killing themselves and the whole group with some kind of disease because they didn't properly handle the meat and whatever. This meat, by the way, after it was sacrificed, was food. It wasn't thrown away. It was food for the priest. It was food. Study what it says. What do you think they did with the sacrifice? Throw it all away? No, they didn't throw it away. It got eaten by thousands of priests, thousands of the Levites tribe. Thousands of people had to eat. Thousands had to eat daily. Thousands of people had to eat daily. God made a provision for them to do that. After the sacrifice, they could eat that meat.